All right, boys. We are finally back. I've been gone for quite some time, but here is part 3 of The Athletic Fighter. In part 1, we talked about grappling and the ways in which athleticism, different aspects of athleticism, influence your ability to perform in grappling. In part 2, we talked about wrestling. And now we are going to finish this mini-series off by going into striking. Now, fittingly, during the time that I was gone, I did also take a bit of a vacation where I spent some time in France training with my brother. And my brother trains boxing, so we did a lot of sparring, a lot of striking training, if you will. I've also been polishing up my own striking over these last couple of weeks, couple of months. I've been training Muay Thai to kind of improve my striking skill, which I haven't really worked on in several years. All that is just to say that I have gotten a decent bit of striking practice, of striking hours during this time that I was gone, which is, of course, a perfect fit to now talk about the ways in which athleticism influences your ability to be a good striker. So let's dive right in with the first thing that I talked about in regards to grappling and wrestling, and now striking, which is size. Now, size is an interesting one because in the previous 2 videos, I didn't make a huge distinction between just being heavy in a sort of body fat kind of way and being tall. I did make a little bit of a distinction, but generally speaking, many of the advantages and disadvantages I talked about applied to both of these things to some degree. In striking, however, there is a big difference here. So let's talk first about size that is mainly based on excess mass, really just being a heavy guy for your stature. And this provides a substantial amount of protection from body shots and to some extent makes you harder to knock out as well because excess fat can actually reduce the amount of vibration your brain receives from a heavy shot. If you have a very thick, chonky neck, even fat can provide some protection. So generally speaking, across the board, being on the chunkier side is going to make you tankier, if you will, in a striking situation. It's going to make it harder to land strikes on you that do a significant amount of damage. It's also potentially going to make you steadier on your feet, meaning that you're not just receiving less damage from attacks, you're also going to be pushed around less, even by heavier strikes, meaning that just in general, across the board, strikes are going to have less of an effect on you, not just in hurting you, but also moving you around, controlling where you are, that sort of thing. However, size can be a huge detriment to your endurance. If you are very heavy, and again, this is essentially just excess weight, this is just you being fatter, this is going to mean that you have to exert more energy to move yourself around, which is going to tax your endurance to a significant degree. Can you be of a substantial size and still have good endurance? Yes, it is possible, but you would certainly have better endurance if you had the same kind of stamina and were just a lighter dude, didn't have that fat on you. In this regard, size can also negatively impact your other athletic attributes, specifically agility and mobility. So it's not just taxing your endurance more, it might also decrease your ability to just move in a full range of motion, to move in general, your ability to react quickly because mass is harder to accelerate. It takes more force to accelerate. So if you invest the same kind of force, your punches, your movements in general, your ability to dodge, all of that will be slower. It's just much easier to control a body the way you want to control it, the way you want to actually move it, if you don't have a bunch of excess mass that doesn't really do anything except hang on your limbs, hang on your torso, and weigh down the movements you're attempting to do. And I think in this way, size can be a pretty big advantage when fighting an opponent who is not very skilled, and perhaps you're not very skilled as well. So if we're talking about a very low skill encounter, these protective advantages can be a pretty big deal. But the further we go on the skill ladder, so let's say you and your opponent are equally skilled, but we're not talking about a very low level of skill, we're talking about something more advanced, size is going to become less advantageous because someone who is skilled is just going to be able to land more shots to your head or land body shots in ways that will still be very uncomfortable, even if you are chonky. And the disadvantages of just, reduced movement speed, reduced reaction time, because even though technically your reactions themselves are just as fast, your ability to actually act, right? If you see something coming and you're trying to dodge it or you're trying to counterpunch, just the fact that your movements are slower is going to effectively reduce your reaction time. These kinds of negatives, your reduced ability to move, to weave, to roll, to duck, to jump out of the way, to punch, to kick it quickly, right, when the moment fits. All of these things, I think, are going to be a bigger detriment the higher we go on the skill ladder than the advantages of size compared to that. So at a very low skill level, being chonky, being fat, just being a massive guy might be an advantage. I think the more skilled the whole encounter becomes, the less advantageous mass is and the more of a detriment it becomes in regards to its cons. Now, some of these aspects do also apply to size that is more in regards to stature, so height, limb length, all of these things. Obviously, someone who is just inherently taller, who just has a bigger frame, a bigger skeleton, is also baseline going to be heavier. Even if you have a tall guy who's not necessarily fat, if you had someone at a similar body fat level, at a similar level of muscularity compared to their frame, the tall person would obviously be heavier because there's just more of them. But height compared to just excess mass is actually a huge advantage in striking. And this especially goes for limb length. So if you're not the tallest guy in the world, but you have very, very long limbs compared to your height, that is still a very, very big advantage, and potentially a bigger advantage than being tall and having relatively short limbs. So the advantage of having long limbs, I think, is rather obvious. You just have a range advantage over your opponent. What this means is that your opponent always has to put himself in danger when he wants to attack you, because you can attack him before he can attack you. If you have longer arms, longer legs, that just means you can kick and punch at a greater range. And so your opponent always has to enter your range to attack you, while you can constantly pester them with jabs, leg kicks, maybe even some slightly higher kicks to the body, just keeping them at the distance while constantly engaging them, constantly attacking them, constantly pestering them, moving them around, pressuring them. And your opponent is going to be forced to work. Something that you can somewhat avoid because it's much easier for you to keep a distance, to kind of maintain your poise, if you will. You might actually be able to land a knockout shot, or a shot that at least has the chance of knocking your opponent out, without putting yourself in any significant danger, because again, you can punch and kick from outside their range. Height is an additional advantage here, and a great example of this is actually Andrew Tate's kind of style of kickboxing, where he essentially abuses his stature by leaning back. And what this does when you're a very tall person is it, of course, still allows your opponent to attack the body. But again, if you have a lot of range, that might not be that easy either. But most importantly, it allows you to get your head even further away from your opponent. So not only do you have the range advantage based on your limbs, but since you are taller than your opponent, so your opponent already has to punch up to get your head, if you lean back, you're getting extra distance from your opponent with that head of yours based on your height. And again, this is something, if you're interested in that kind of thing, that Andrew Tate utilizes to a very significant extent. That's why I'm mentioning him here as an example. I think he illustrates this use of height in striking very, very well. So if you're interested in that specifically, you can go ahead and look at some of his sparring sessions, that type of thing. Now that we've gone through size, both in regards to excess mass, fat essentially, and in regards to height, let's talk about strength and muscle-based mass. So this is additional weight potentially, but additional weight in the form of muscle mass. And I think the primary advantage here is also quite obvious. Having more muscle mass is going to make your punches more powerful. Now, being heavier in general will make your punches heavier, but depending on how heavy you are, depending on how skilled you are at striking, and some other factors, your punches being heavier might not necessarily mean that they are that effective. Because if your punches are very heavy, but also very slow and uncoordinated due to the fact that this excess mass slows down your movements and hinders your agility and mobility, the final result might not be all that. Force, of course, is mass times acceleration. So the ability to actually throw a punch with some level of speed, with a decent level of acceleration on top of its mass, is pretty important. And compared to just having a lot of fat, what muscle mass does is, yes, it makes your punches heavier and it adds weight that you have to move, but the muscle mass is also the thing moving the weight. And so generally speaking, while there is a point of diminishing returns, I do believe, your punches are just across the board going to get more powerful. They might get slower at some point as you keep increasing and increasing the muscle mass you have, but the total power of your punches, I think, will generally continue to go up, even if, again, there's a kind of sweet spot at which point the benefit that you're going to get is definitely going to taper off. Additional muscle mass is also going to make you tankier and steadier on your feet, depending on how much muscle mass we're talking about, how much strength we're talking about, and on the other hand, how much fat, how much excess weight we're talking about. Muscle mass might be even more valuable when it comes to protection and kind of being able to maintain your posture, maintain your poise when you take punches. Just because of the fact that you can actively manipulate this mass. You can also flex your muscles when you receive something like a body shot. And a muscular neck is probably the best way to protect you from a concussion, to protect you from a knockout shot that you can actually train for. There are obviously aspects of, skull shape, the way your jaw is shaped, all of these types of things that will go into your ability to take a shot to the chin, to the jaw. But in terms of the things you can actually train, a muscular neck is where it's at. And in this regard, muscle mass is probably the best thing you can have for defense. Overall, I would say that strength is a pretty big advantage. It definitely gives you the ability to do a lot in a striking context with a low level of skill. However, there is a point that you will reach where, again, you're going to see diminishing returns, not just in your ability to strike, but in general, if you pack on more muscle mass and you forcibly try to focus on that. Again, having a lot of mass is going to mean that this is a greater tax on your endurance. And potentially, it's also going to reduce your speed, both in regards to your punches and also your movements in general. Now, again, muscle mass also mitigates some of the speed loss that is created by the additional mass because of the fact that the muscle is the thing accelerating you. But I think once you reach a certain level of skill, strength has value in increasing the power of your punches, but skill is actually much more important, and to an extent, your ability to utilize skill with something like agility, which we're going to get into, that's going to be much more important to actually knock someone out. Because of the simple fact that you don't have to actually punch that hard to send someone to sleep. A well-timed punch that your opponent is slightly moving into, that is coming completely out of left field, maybe it's a perfect counter, maybe it's coming from an angle that the opponent didn't expect. A punch like that doesn't really have to be that hard to end the fight. And because of this fact, again, yes, strength is very useful, but if you acquire a certain level of skill, and if we continue to ramp up the skill level of you and your opponent, the higher we go up the skill ladder, the less relevant strength potentially becomes. If there's a huge discrepancy between you and your opponent, it's definitely still going to be of value. But again, things like timing, technique, just your ability to land relatively clean punches when they're supposed to land is going to be much more valuable. So while strength is still very, very valuable, I do think compared to grappling and wrestling, it is significantly less important in striking compared to other athletic components. Whereas in grappling and wrestling, if you go back and watch those videos, I talked about this, strength is just a huge thing. And anyone who denies this is out of their mind. Like, strength gives you such a huge advantage that you can actually, if the advantage is substantial, engage with some pretty skilled opponents. In striking, I would say less so. Definitely less so. If a striker is very, very good, you might have a big strength advantage on them, but if they land that one clean shot, you're gone. Now, as I did in the previous two parts, I will also separate strength a little bit into more explosive strength and strength endurance to kind of look at what type of strength is also perhaps more valuable. And I think in the striking context, without a shadow of a doubt, strength endurance is way more important than explosive strength. This is not to say that explosive strength is irrelevant. Obviously, explosive strength is going to be much more relevant when it comes to the power of your punches. But once you reach a certain point when it comes to explosive strength, again, as I mentioned before, because of certain mitigating factors, the advantage you gain from having more powerful punches is probably in reality not going to be that great, even if your punches are actually becoming more powerful due to you having more explosive strength. If you're not landing them, that's not really that relevant. And if they were powerful enough to knock out your opponent before, then this is not really a huge advantage. On the flip side, if you contrast this with strength endurance, especially in the upper body, in the shoulders, the arms, that type of thing, is incredibly important for keeping your arms up, for blocking shots, for continuously throwing shots, right? You're doing a lot of things where your arms are up, where your shoulders are moving. And having a very solid level of strength endurance in your shoulders, in your legs as well, right? Even if you're a boxer and you're not throwing any kicks or anything like that, you're constantly on your feet, you're moving around, right? So you're essentially walking, jumping, skipping, doing these types of movements the entire time throughout the fight. And of course, this goes even more for people who throw kicks as well. So in general, your shoulders and legs are a pretty big deal. And just in general, having good strength endurance is going to be a huge factor in you being able to maintain a quality stance throughout your striking encounter and just continue to engage with your opponent, as opposed to, getting kind of tired, starting to drop your arms here and there. This is the type of thing that can get you knocked out. And this is where strength endurance really shines. So next, let's get into endurance. And I don't really have that much to say about endurance regarding striking, other than it's just a huge benefit. Across the board, endurance is going to be a big deal. The longer a striking encounter lasts, the more endurance it is going to cost you. There's no real downsides to having more endurance. There's huge upsides to having more endurance. So I don't really know what to say here. Endurance across the board, very, very beneficial to fighting, to striking. Now, in regards to different types of endurance that we can look at, in the previous videos, I talked about your sort of immediate stamina, your ability to do something that is very high effort, something like a sprint for as long as possible. Your baseline endurance, if you will, so your ability to do something for an extended period of time. And then your ability to recover your stamina, your ability to recover your endurance as quickly as possible. And I think all three of these are incredibly beneficial in striking. Your sort of baseline endurance is important to just give you the ability to stay in a fight for an extended period of time. I do think this is more important for sort of professional matches, for a context where you're actually having specifically a striking exchange, as opposed to striking as a part of fighting in a real-world situation. Why? Because most real-world situations actually end pretty quickly. Most people in real fights don't play things slow, don't test out their opponent. In many situations, you're facing more than one opponent, or it's two groups facing each other. So there's this element of chaos as well. Generally, in my experience, people in real fights are just a lot more proactive, a lot more aggressive. They don't want to take the risk of being hit in an uncomfortable way, being knocked out, being choked out, because you don't know what's going to happen after you're out. So most people are a lot less careful, are a lot less, I'm going to, test out what my opponent is going to do. I'm going to figure him out. Most people just go all in. So in a real world fight situation, I think your immediate stamina, your ability to do something very intense for as long as possible, is going to be more valuable. It's going to allow you to blitz your opponent, for example, just throw a crazy combination that pressures him, that allows you to maybe land a punch here and there, and ideally just end the fight very, very quickly. And your ability to recover stamina, I think, is also quite important in this context, because if that first blitz, if that first pressure moment doesn't work and you're completely spent, you have no energy left, and you're very incapable of quickly recovering, that's going to be a big problem. So I think in a real world fighting situation, in regards to striking, This more immediate stamina is most important, followed by your ability to recover immediate stamina, and then your sort of baseline endurance. In more of a striking match, your baseline endurance is going to be much more relevant. Your ability to recover stamina is also going to be much more relevant because, generally speaking, the fight is going to be longer. The only thing to note in regards to endurance is that it is entirely passive as an advantage. Endurance does nothing for you if you're weak and unskilled. So, similarly to the situation we had with grappling and with wrestling, endurance is very, very beneficial across the board, great to have, but endurance itself doesn't actually do anything. You need the ability to attack your opponent, and only strength or skill are going to give you that to a significant degree. Again, being fat might make your punches heavier, but it's probably not going to enhance your offensive capabilities to a significant degree. Now, what about agility? Agility is an interesting one because I think agility was valuable when I talked about it in regards to grappling and wrestling, but agility is actually a really, really big deal when it comes to striking because your ability to time strikes well and to execute them perfectly, to execute them when they need to be executed and how they need to be executed is key to knocking someone out, to really demolishing someone with your striking. If you're facing someone who is on a similar level in regards to the other athletic attributes, but you have significantly better reflexes, body control, balance, just your overall intuitive ability to move your body is significantly better than theirs. Outside of any specific skills, this is going to be extremely beneficial just because of the aspect of timing, right? And of course, when it comes to footwork, when it comes to weaving and bobbing and rolling and what have you, right? Agility, huge deal. Your ability to time things correctly and move the way you actually intend to move is such a big deal in striking. So I think compared to grappling and wrestling, where I didn't exactly speak negatively of agility, I do think it is beneficial in those areas as well. But compared to striking, it's night and day. Agility might potentially be one of, if not the most valuable thing to really focus on, to really train out of this list I'm going through here. Now, agility also doesn't really have any cons to it. I will say that agility is significantly more valuable when paired with either strength or skill. So in regards to striking, it is not entirely a passive buff. This is not the same situation we have with endurance, because agility can actually give a relatively unskilled person the ability to perform some decent enough striking. Someone who is agile will have an intuitive understanding of how to generate power with something like a punch. So even though their striking might not be the best in the world, even though it might not look great, just their intuitive ability to move effectively and efficiently is going to give them some offensive and defensive capabilities without having any strength or skill that is, relevant to this conversation. But it will be significantly more valuable if you also have a substantial level of strength and or skill. And the sort of bonus point that we have with agility, similarly to wrestling and grappling, where I also mentioned this, is that being a very agile person, having a very intuitive understanding of how your body moves, being very in touch with every part of your body, having great balance, hand-eye coordination, all of these types of things, all of this is going to make it a lot easier to acquire striking skills. So agility is not just a buff to your fighting ability. It is also, as with grappling, as with wrestling, a buff to your ability to acquire specific skill in the area of striking on top of this, which makes agility very, very valuable, again, for someone who actually wants to go into striking, who actually wants to learn striking. And then finally, I, of course, want to touch on mobility, which there's not a ton to say about as well. Mobility, I think, is pretty beneficial when it comes to striking. It's quite valuable. Maybe not quite as valuable as, say, endurance, because someone who doesn't have great mobility can still be pretty decent when it comes to things like boxing. In terms of, just the strikes you can throw with your hands. You can do a lot without having great mobility, but having great mobility just increases the amount of tools you have available, just your ability to do things that you wouldn't be able to do, things like high kicks, for example, different types of kicks that are only possible if you have a certain range of motion. All these types of things are things you're going to gain if you improve your mobility. And a better level of mobility is also going to some extent, increase your defensive capabilities because it's also going to enhance your ability to avoid hits. If you're just flat out able to move into more positions than someone else, you just have a greater range of motion regarding essentially every part of your body. This is going to make you capable of avoiding hits, of dodging hits that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Now, you still need the reflexes, you still need the skill and or agility to actually dodge those hits. And that's the thing with mobility here. Just as with endurance, it is mostly a passive buff. Again, it does give you more attack options. It does give you the ability to do some things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. But generally speaking, mobility is not going to do a ton for you unless you have something else that actually utilizes that mobility. It is mostly a passive buff, really. Even with these additional attacks, if we look at something like a head kick, if you have the mobility to throw a head kick, but you have no strength behind that kick, you don't have great agility, so the way in which you perform the kick is not going to be great. You also didn't learn the kick. We are assuming this, of course, so your level of skill is not great either. How exactly are you going to throw that kick in a way that is actually going to make it count? You're probably not. So while mobility is beneficial, while it does give you some advantages, generally speaking, mobility's advantages in the world of striking are tied to other aspects, either strength and or agility, or a substantial level of skill. That's actually going to be it for today. Now, before I finish this video, something I did want to do at the end of this mini-series is kind of go through these categories, these attributes of athleticism that I have gone through in these 3 parts, and rank them, quote unquote, in regards to their value for fighting in general. So including grappling, wrestling, and striking, which one of these makes the most sense to really focus on, to spend a lot of time training, as opposed to others which might not be that valuable. I think the obvious odd man out here is size. Since you can train your height or limb length to any significant degree, you can affect it a little bit during growth. But generally speaking, your height, obviously is not something you can go to the gym and change to any significant degree. We can kind of leave this out of the discussion. And when it comes to size, we are essentially just talking about excess fat, about just being heavy without necessarily having significantly more muscle mass or strength. And I would say across the board, this is the least beneficial. It can actually be quite detrimental in some cases. Size does have some advantages, I think, especially at a low skill level. So if you and your opponent are not very skilled, size is going to be more relevant and more beneficial for your ability to dominate. But as we increase other attributes on this list and or skill, size is going to become less relevant, and the cons of having excess fat are going to become more relevant. So I think in general, being chonky, being big, being fat, not the greatest thing in the world for fighting if you're not just, brawling with a couple of completely unskilled randoms at a bar or something. Next, I would probably have to name mobility because of the simple fact that mobility can be very, very beneficial. It does have its merits in grappling, in wrestling, in striking, in all areas of fighting. It is definitely beneficial, but you can perform very, very well without having a substantial level of mobility. And so I think the most important thing when it comes to mobility is not being stiff, not necessarily having a crazy level of mobility, but just not having a very poor level of mobility. And anything beyond that is kind of extra. It can enhance your ability to fight. It can enhance your ability to practice certain styles of fighting that, for instance, utilize a lot of high kicks, things of that nature. There are also certain grappling techniques, things like that. I talked about this in previous videos where mobility is very beneficial or even gives you the ability to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. But these things are not necessary for winning a fight, and they are not necessary for performing at a pretty substantial level. A great level of mobility is going to enhance you as a fighter, but if you train that at the detriment of other athletic endeavors, if you invest a lot of time into working on your mobility as opposed to your strength, your agility, your endurance, that is definitely, in my opinion, going to be a waste of time if we're talking about actual fighting. Because again, mobility is a nice plus, but it's actually most relevant when you don't have it at all. And once you have a somewhat reasonable level of mobility for an athlete, anything beyond that is not really a necessity. Next, I'm going to put agility and endurance kind of on the same level. And this might be a controversial decision for some people because obviously this leaves strength as the most important athletic attribute, and I'll get into that in a moment. But the main reason I am doing this is because endurance and agility are generally less useful on their own compared to strength. So I think agility and especially endurance are incredibly valuable in enhancing your fighting capabilities if you have something going for you, if you have a substantial level of skill, if you're a very, very strong person, right? Maybe all of your athletic attributes are at a great level, and if you have a great level of endurance on top of that, that is going to enhance you like crazy. But generally speaking, agility and especially endurance are not going to be that valuable if you just have those. And these are attributes that I think it does make sense to take to a very high level, potentially, as a fighter, especially endurance, again. But I think it makes more sense to consistently train them to a decent degree on the side for many, many years, as opposed to focusing a significant chunk of time and effort and energy into training these. Essentially, I wouldn't recommend to anyone to have like a dedicated agility or a dedicated endurance phase where they really focus on training one of these attributes primarily or even almost exclusively to really get that crazy level of endurance or that crazy level of agility. I don't think that's a good approach. Rather, what I would recommend to people is to train these things consistently, very, very regularly, very frequently, potentially every day a little bit, but not invest a crazy amount of time into it and always be training something else on the side. Do something like strength training, do something like going to actual martial arts classes, right? Improving your skills, and train endurance and agility on the side, but importantly, never stop, continuously doing so, because there's no sort of cutoff point at which these become irrelevant. If you have more endurance in a fight, you have more endurance in a fight. There's no, oh, at this point it becomes irrelevant. No, if you have more endurance, the fight is more chill for you, just across the board. So keep working on your endurance, keep improving it, but don't go all in on it. And the same thing again goes for agility. Keep improving it, keep working on it. It's also going to enhance your ability to actually learn martial arts again. So agility also very, very valuable, but don't go all in on this. And then finally, there is one big reason why I am putting strength at the top of this list. And that is the simple fact that out of all of these athletic capabilities, strength is the only one that reliably gives you the ability to actually fight your opponent without any relevant level of skill. Across all three domains, grappling, wrestling, and striking, strength is not only beneficial, but at least to some extent gives you the active ability to fight. And that is the main problem with many of these other attributes. They enhance your ability to fight, but they don't actually give you the capability to fight on their own. Now, you might say this is irrelevant if you have skill, but the thing is, strength is still valuable if you have skill. In fact, it is multiplied by your skill. But on top of this fact, let's say you're a very skilled striker, but your wrestling and grappling isn't exactly great. Strength kind of compensates for that, because if you're a strong person, that is going to give you some capabilities across the board. There is, however, a caveat. I think there comes a point where strength and muscle-based mass, muscle-based size, do kind of see a drop off in value. And I think this point, if you separate grappling, wrestling, and striking, is reached at different stages of your strength and muscle growth progression, just because strength can be utilized to a greater or lesser extent in these three areas. Of course, if we're talking about fighting in general, I think the level of strength you can acquire before it starts to not be that relevant anymore is very high. You can definitely reach a very, very substantial level of strength. You can get very muscular before the benefits kind of taper off, and perhaps some of the cons that I've talked about in these three videos become more apparent. But I think generally speaking, for most people who don't take steroids, they can continue to improve their strength and muscle mass as they go along on their martial arts journey, and it's just going to be beneficial, but not to the same degree that endurance and agility are. There comes a point where getting bigger, and again, I'm talking about muscle mass here, not even excess fat, but we're getting bigger even in that fashion, is going to require a level of dedication, a level of specialized training for strength, for muscle growth, that is not proportional to the benefits you're getting as opposed to using that time, using that energy to train something else. And so even though I'm putting strength at the top of this list, I think it makes the most sense to dedicate a significant chunk of time, a significant period in your early lifting, training, fighting career into training your strength, training your muscle mass to a very substantial level of what you're naturally capable of, and then kind of maintaining that, slowly maybe grinding out some additional gains, but focusing on, for example, your martial art, your combat sport. So as opposed to endurance and agility, I do think it makes sense for many, if not most people, to actually specialize on strength and muscle building training for some time until they've built a very solid basis, because that's just going to make a huge difference in their ability, even if they are skilled, to apply their skill. And then once they've reached a pretty substantial level, once they've built a pretty substantial physique, I've talked about this in the past, at that point, I do think it makes sense to focus on things like conditioning, maybe, maintaining most of that muscle mass, but trying to lean out your body, trying to improve your endurance without losing any of that mass, working on your agility more, working on your mobility, training your actual skills when it comes to fighting. Again, so yeah, strength is at the top of this list, but I do think strength and muscle building training has its place, has its time, and there comes a point where it's not going to enhance your fighting capabilities to a significant degree. Now, of course, you have a drop off in actual progress. You have diminishing returns in almost every area. You can't infinitely increase your mobility. Of course, your body is limited to the ways in which it can actually mechanically move. You can't infinitely increase your agility, your endurance. But I think the drop off in value compared to the amount of time you're investing with strength is much more significant than with something like endurance or agility, because it's also much easier to train something like endurance in a much more casual, kind of on the side manner. You don't need a ton of programming, nothing like that. You can essentially just run for longer and longer times, or you can try to run for the same amount of time and increase the distance you're able to run in that time, that sort of thing. No matter which type of cardio we're looking at here, the progressions, the whole sort of training scheme is very simple compared to hypertrophy training, for example. So long story short, yes, I do think that all in all, strength is the most valuable attribute to have at a significant level when it comes to fighting. But I do think it makes sense to train this very hard and then kind of, maintain it, keep it on the side, progress maybe a little bit later on, as opposed to some of these other attributes, which I think you should consistently work on. And you can basically train these until you fall dead. Like, I don't see any reason to ease up on your endurance training at any point in your martial arts career. All right, that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed yourselves, learned something, maybe felt inspired to tweak your training here and there to kind of improve the effects it has on your general physical prowess, your fighting capability specifically, perhaps. And if you don't have a training program yet, if that's something you're interested in, you actually want the whole package, perhaps a nutrition plan, something like that as well, to actually get into the kind of shape a fighter should have, or someone who wants to engage in athletic endeavors in general, then you can go ahead and check out the Primal Physique course down below in the description. As always, this course is a comprehensive package. There's everything in there, from the basics of making training a consistent habit in your life at all. That doesn't feel like a chore you have to actively kind of overcome yourself to practice. Rather, it's just going to feel like a day-to-day activity after you're done with that module. And we got all different kinds of stuff that you're going to need to build the physique, build the body that you actually want. We're going to talk about progression. We're going to talk, of course, about diet and nutrition. We're going to talk about habits outside of training and nutrition that are going to influence your athletic capabilities, your physical prowess, the way you feel, the way you move. All of these things are covered in the course, very comprehensive. I also made it very dense, so there's not a lot of unnecessary yapping. The course is comparatively short to what you're actually getting. I made sure to, not talk for hours. I actually cut this down very concisely. So within a very limited time frame, you can consume a lot of knowledge. You can watch these videos back. You can take notes, all that good stuff. So if you're interested in learning how to build the body you fucking want, the barbarian physique, the primal physique, the body of the gods, go ahead, check out the Primal Physique course down below. I'm also going to be uploading some of my training programs to Coffee, which is where the course is, in the next couple of days. because if people want to support this channel financially, but they don't believe in charity, I want to give them the option to have something for $2 or $3 that they can grab. $2 or $3 in my back pocket. I got that money. You're supporting the channel, but you're also getting something for it in return. So some of my training programs for strength endurance, for power, for muscle growth in general, these types of things, I'm just going to upload some of these programs. And again, if you want to support the channel, you can head over to Ko-fi, take a look. Maybe you see a program that looks like something you might enjoy. Maybe you've been on your own training program, a training program you maybe grabbed from another YouTuber for quite some time now, and you're looking for something new. If that's the case, again, go check out those programs. I'll be uploading in the next couple of days. And maybe for $2 or $3, you feel like grabbing one, trying something out. And finally, as always, if you're interested in a more personalized approach, you actually want to talk to me in person about nutrition, about training. This can be anything from super specific stuff to generally setting up like a training routine, or even just a sort of weekly routine that allows for training and proper nutrition. We can talk about all of this stuff. All you got to do is hit me up either on Ko-fi again, or you can go over to my Instagram, which is down below in the description as well, and you can just DM me over there. And again, we can talk about all kinds of stuff. I can make a personalized training program for you if that's something you're interested in, a program that is perfectly tailored to your needs, your current goals, perhaps, also the kind of lifestyle you're currently living, the way your week looks, all of this type of stuff. So if you want the personalized experience, go ahead and hit me up on Ko-fi or on Instagram. If you want to see more videos of mine in the future, of course, go ahead and subscribe. I make videos on more training related topics like this, things like lifting, martial arts, that type of stuff. But I also talk about more general health topics, things like nutrition, other aspects of health. And I do also speak about philosophy. So a very holistic approach to men's fitness. And if that's something you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe and activate the notification bell if you want notifications. And yeah, I think that's going to be it. If you guys want to drop a comment to help the algorithm a little bit, push my channel, I would very much appreciate that. I'll see you guys in the next one. And until then, have a good one.